The Philippines, 1945. The war in the Pacific was reaching its brutal climax, and in a makeshift prisoner-of-war camp hidden deep in the jungle, one man was about to face death with an act so unexpected that it would shatter everything the Americans thought they knew about their enemy. What happened next would haunt Sergeant James Morrison for the rest of his life. The morning sun barely broke through the thick canopy of trees surrounding Camp 17, a prisoner-of-war facility hastily constructed after American forces recaptured the region from Japanese control. The air was thick with humidity and tension. Sergeant James Morrison stood at his post, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the crude wooden structure that served as the camp's holding cells. Today was execution day. After months of interrogations and military tribunals, the verdict had come down. Takeshi Yamamoto, a captured Japanese soldier accused of war crimes during the Bataan operations, was sentenced to death by firing squad. Morrison had volunteered for guard duty, not because he enjoyed this grim work, but because he needed to see it through. His younger brother David had died at Bataan during the death march, 65 miles of hell where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners perished from exhaustion, disease, and brutal treatment by their Japanese captors. Every time Morrison closed his eyes, he saw David's face in those final letters home, full of hope and courage. Now David was gone, buried somewhere in that cursed Philippine soil, and Morrison carried that rage like a stone in his chest. Captain Edward Sullivan, the camp's second-in-command, approached Morrison with heavy footsteps. Sullivan was a broad-shouldered man from Boston who had lost 2 brothers in the Pacific Campaign. His face was carved from granite, his eyes cold and distant. He had presided over Yamamoto's tribunal personally, and his verdict had been swift and merciless. War criminal. Death by firing squad. No appeals. Sullivan stopped beside Morrison and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the humid morning air. The captain said nothing for a long moment, just stared at the holding cells. Then he spoke, his voice low and hard. They would bring Yamamoto out at 0800 hours. The firing squad was assembled. Colonel Bradford had signed the final order. It was done. Morrison nodded stiffly. He felt nothing but a hollow satisfaction. This was justice, he told himself. Justice for David. Justice for all the men who suffered and died. Sullivan took another drag from his cigarette and added that Morrison would escort the prisoner to the execution site. It was an honor, Sullivan said, though the word tasted like ash. Morrison accepted without hesitation. At precisely 8 in the morning, the door to Yamamoto's cell creaked open. Morrison stepped inside, followed by Private George Nakamura, a young Japanese-American soldier who served as the camp's translator. Nakamura was a quiet man, barely 22, who had grown up in California before his family was sent to an internment camp. He had volunteered for military service to prove his loyalty to America, but the war had left him caught between 2 worlds, speaking the language of the enemy while wearing the uniform of his country. Inside the cell, Takeshi Yamamoto sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He was thin from months of captivity, his uniform tattered and dirty, but there was something unnervingly composed about him. His face was weathered and lined, perhaps 40 years old, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and acceptance. When Morrison entered, Yamamoto slowly rose to his feet. He stood at attention, not in defiance but with a quiet dignity that caught Morrison off guard. Morrison barked the order. It was time. Nakamura translated, his voice soft and hesitant. Yamamoto bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. He did not resist as Morrison secured his hands behind his back with rough rope. As they led him out of the cell into the blinding morning sun, Morrison noticed something strange. Yamamoto was humming. It was barely audible, a low melody that seemed ancient and mournful. Morrison felt a flash of anger. How dare this man find peace in his final moments after what his people had done? But he said nothing, just gripped Yamamoto's arm tighter and marched him forward. The execution site was a clearing about 200 yards from the main camp. A wooden post had been driven into the ground and 6 soldiers stood in formation, rifles at the ready. Captain Sullivan was already there, along with Colonel William Bradford, the camp commander. Bradford was a tall, silver-haired man from Virginia, a career military officer who had seen action in the First World War. He believed in order, discipline, and following protocol to the letter. He watched impassively as Morrison brought the prisoner forward. Sullivan read the charges aloud. Takeshi Yamamoto, soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, was found guilty of war crimes including participation in the forced march of prisoners, cruel treatment of captured soldiers, and collaboration in acts resulting in the deaths of Allied personnel. The sentence was death. As Sullivan spoke, Morrison studied Yamamoto's face. The man showed no emotion, no fear, no anger, just that same unsettling calm. When Sullivan finished, he asked if the prisoner had any final words. Nakamura translated the question. Yamamoto was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the faces of the American soldiers surrounding him. Then he spoke in Japanese, his voice steady and clear. Nakamura's face paled as he listened. The translator hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Sullivan snapped at him to speak. Nakamura swallowed hard and translated. Yamamoto said he accepted his fate. He had been a soldier, and soldiers must face the consequences of war. He asked for no mercy. But he wished to say that he had never raised his hand against prisoners. He had been a medic, not a combat soldier. He had tried to save lives, not take them. Sullivan's jaw tightened. He cut the air with his hand dismissively. Lies. He spat. Desperate lies from a desperate man. Every one of them claimed innocence when facing the firing squad. Yamamoto had been identified by 2 survivors of the Bataan March. His fate was sealed. Morrison felt a flicker of doubt, but he crushed it immediately. This was the enemy. This was one of the men responsible for David's death. There was no room for doubt. Colonel Bradford stepped forward and asked if there were any other final requests. Yamamoto spoke again, and Nakamura translated. The prisoner asked permission to face his executioners and to die on his feet, not tied to the post. It was a matter of honor. Sullivan immediately objected. Protocol demanded the prisoner be secured, but Bradford considered for a moment, then nodded. He would allow it. The prisoner would stand free, but any attempt to escape would result in immediate execution. Yamamoto bowed deeply to Bradford, a gesture of profound respect that seemed to surprise even the stoic colonel. Morrison untied the ropes binding Yamamoto's hands. As the bonds fell away, the Japanese soldier rubbed his wrists slowly, then straightened his torn uniform as best he could. He walked calmly to the wooden post, then turned to face the firing squad. The 6 riflemen raised their weapons, sighting down the barrels. Morrison stood to the side, his own rifle ready, watching every movement. This was it. In seconds, justice would be served. But then something happened that no one expected. Takeshi Yamamoto turned his gaze directly to Morrison. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, Morrison saw something that shook him. Not hatred, not defiance, but a deep, aching sadness. And then Yamamoto did something that would change everything. He bowed. Not to Colonel Bradford, not to the assembled officers, but to Morrison. A deep, formal bow of respect, the kind reserved for honoring the dead or acknowledging a profound debt. He held the bow for 3 long seconds, his head lowered, his hands at his sides. Morrison felt his breath catch in his throat. What was this? Some kind of trick? A final insult? But when Yamamoto straightened, there were tears streaming down his face. He spoke rapidly in Japanese, his voice breaking with emotion. Nakamura's eyes went wide with shock. The translator stammered, struggling to find the words. Sullivan demanded to know what the prisoner was saying. Nakamura's voice trembled as he translated. Yamamoto was saying that he recognized Morrison. Not personally, but he recognized the look in his eyes. The look of a man who had lost a brother. Yamamoto said that he too had lost a brother in this war. His younger brother Kenji had died on Guadalcanal, killed by American artillery. Yamamoto understood Morrison's pain because he carried the same pain. He bowed to Morrison to honor that shared grief, to acknowledge that both of them were trapped in the same endless cycle of loss and revenge. The clearing fell utterly silent. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Morrison stood frozen, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This man, this enemy, understood what he felt. Understood David. Sullivan broke the silence, his voice sharp and angry. This was manipulation, he insisted, a psychological game. They needed to proceed immediately. Colonel Bradford raised his hand for silence. His face was unreadable, but something in his expression had shifted. He asked Nakamura to ask Yamamoto a direct question. Had he or had he not participated in the mistreatment of prisoners during the Bataan March? Yamamoto met the colonel's eyes and spoke clearly. Nakamura translated. Yamamoto said he had been stationed at a field hospital along the route. He had treated wounded prisoners, both Allied and Japanese. He had given water when he had it. He had tried to save lives, but he had failed more often than he succeeded. He carried the faces of the men he could not save. They haunted his dreams. Captain Sullivan exploded with rage. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and thrust it toward Bradford. 2 witnesses had identified Yamamoto, he shouted. 2 survivors who swore they saw this man strike prisoners, deny them water and leave wounded men to die on the roadside. The evidence was clear. Sullivan demanded they stop wasting time and carry out the sentence. Morrison's mind was spinning. He wanted to believe Sullivan. He needed to believe that this execution was righteous. But doubt gnawed at him like a disease. What if Yamamoto was telling the truth? What if the wrong man was about to die? Colonel Bradford studied the document, then looked at Yamamoto for a long moment. He turned to Nakamura and gave a new order. Asked the prisoner if he kept any records, any documentation of his service, any proof of his assignment. Yamamoto hesitated, then spoke. Nakamura translated. Before his capture, Yamamoto had buried a medical kit containing his service documents and a diary near the ruins of a church outside Manila. He had hoped to retrieve it if he survived the war. He could describe the exact location. Sullivan protested vehemently. This was absurd. They couldn't delay an execution on the word of a condemned man. It could take days to verify his story, and it was probably a lie designed to buy time. But Bradford silenced him with a look. The colonel was old enough to remember the mistakes of the First War, the hasty judgments that haunted men for decades afterward. He would not repeat those errors. Bradford announced that the execution would be postponed for 72 hours, while a team investigated Yamamoto's claims. If the documents were found and corroborated his story, the case would be reviewed. If they were not found, or if they proved him guilty, the sentence would be carried out immediately. Sullivan looked like he wanted to argue further, but Bradford's tone left no room for debate. Morrison was ordered to escort Yamamoto back to his cell. As Morrison stepped forward, his legs felt like lead. The walk back to the holding cells was surreal. Morrison gripped Yamamoto's arm, but the anger that had burned so hot that morning had cooled to confusion and turmoil. Yamamoto walked quietly beside him, his face drained of color but still composed. When they reached the cell, Morrison unlocked the door and gestured for Yamamoto to enter. But before he did, Yamamoto turned and spoke directly to Morrison in halting broken English. He said he was sorry for Morrison's brother. He was sorry for all the brothers lost. War made enemies of men who should have been friends. Morrison couldn't respond. His throat was too tight. He just nodded stiffly and locked the cell door. As he walked away, he heard Yamamoto begin to hum that same mournful melody again, and Morrison realized it sounded like a prayer. That afternoon, Colonel Bradford assembled a small search team. Morrison volunteered immediately, though he couldn't quite explain why. He needed to know the truth. Captain Sullivan also insisted on joining, determined to prove Yamamoto was lying. Private Nakamura would serve as translator if needed. They took a jeep and drove the 30 miles to the outskirts of Manila. Following the detailed directions Yamamoto had provided, the city was still scarred from brutal fighting, buildings reduced to rubble, streets torn apart by tank treads and artillery. The church Yamamoto described had been a beautiful Spanish colonial structure before the war. Now it was a hollow shell, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, its roof collapsed inward. The team spent 2 hours searching through debris and overgrown vegetation. Sullivan became increasingly frustrated, certain they were chasing phantoms. But Morrison kept digging, driven by something he couldn't name. And then beneath a fallen timber near what had been the church's garden, Morrison's shovel struck something solid. He dropped to his knees and began pulling away dirt and broken stone with his bare hands. It was a metal box, rusted but intact. Morrison lifted it carefully and set it on a cleared patch of ground. His hands were shaking. Sullivan crowded close, his face skeptical. Morrison pried open the corroded latch. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were papers, documents. Morrison carefully unfolded them. There was a service record stamped with official Imperial Army seals, assignment papers, and a small, leather-bound diary filled with dense Japanese characters. Nakamura took the documents with trembling hands and began to read. As he scanned the pages, his expression shifted from skepticism to shock. He looked up at Colonel Bradford with wide eyes. "These were authentic," he said. The service record confirmed Yamamoto had been assigned as a medical corpsman to the 14th Army Field Hospital Unit. The dates matched the Bataan March period. The diary contained daily entries describing his work, treating wounded soldiers, both Japanese and Allied. There were even names, descriptions of injuries, desperate attempts to secure medical supplies. Sullivan snatched the diary from Nakamura's hands and flipped through the pages as if he could read Japanese through sheer force of will. This proved nothing, he insisted. Yamamoto could have served as a medic and still committed atrocities. The witnesses had identified him. Morrison felt anger rise in his chest, but this time it was directed at Sullivan. He asked the captain point blank if he had actually interviewed the witnesses personally, or if he had relied on written statements. Sullivan's face reddened. He had reviewed the statements, he said defensively. That was sufficient. Colonel Bradford intervened quietly but firmly. They would return to camp immediately and conduct a proper investigation. The witnesses would be brought in for in-person identification. The documents would be reviewed by military intelligence, and if there was any reasonable doubt about Yamamoto's guilt, the execution would not proceed. Sullivan opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to think better of it. He stalked back to the jeep without another word. Back at Camp 17, Bradford worked through the night. He ordered military intelligence to verify the authenticity of the documents, which they confirmed by the following morning. The seals, paper stock, and handwriting analysis all indicated the materials were genuine. Next, Bradford demanded the two witnesses who had identified Yamamoto be brought to the camp for a lineup identification. It took another day to locate them. Both men were former prisoners of war who had survived the Bataan Death March and were recovering in a military hospital. They arrived at the camp on the third day, gaunt and haunted, their bodies bearing the scars of their ordeal. Morrison watched as they were led into an observation room. 6 Japanese prisoners were lined up behind a one-way mirror, Yamamoto among them. The first witness, a corporal named Davies, stared at the lineup for a long time, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. Bradford asked if he saw the man who had abused prisoners during the march. Davies pointed immediately at prisoner number 4. It was not Yamamoto. The second witness, a private named Kowalski, was brought in. He had been more specific in his written statement, describing the perpetrator as a Japanese soldier who wore a medic's armband and used his position to deny treatment to Allied prisoners. Kowalski studied the lineup carefully. The room was silent, except for the hum of the overhead fan. Then Kowalski pointed. Number 3, also not Yamamoto. Captain Sullivan looked stunned, his face draining of color. Bradford remained calm, but Morrison could see the weight of what had nearly happened settling on the colonel's shoulders. They had almost executed an innocent man. Bradford ordered Yamamoto released from the lineup and brought to his office. When Yamamoto entered, flanked by Morrison and Nakamura, the Japanese soldier looked exhausted but maintained that same quiet dignity. Bradford spoke through Nakamura, his words measured and grave. The investigation had cleared Yamamoto of the specific charges brought against him. The witnesses had identified other men. The documentary evidence supported his account. However, Bradford continued, as a captured soldier of an enemy nation, Yamamoto would remain a prisoner of war until the formal end of hostilities. Yamamoto bowed deeply to Bradford. Through Nakamura, he expressed gratitude not for his life, but for the truth being heard. He said he understood the colonel's duty and would accept his continued imprisonment with honor. Bradford dismissed them, but as Morrison escorted Yamamoto back to the cells, the sergeant's mind was in turmoil. He had been so certain, so sure that executing Yamamoto would bring some measure of peace for David's death, but now he realized it would have been just another senseless death in a war full of them. That evening, Morrison did something he had never done before. He requested permission to speak with Yamamoto privately. Bradford, after a moment's consideration, granted it. Morrison sat across from Yamamoto in the cell, with Nakamura translating. For a long time, neither man spoke. Then Morrison asked the question that had been burning in his mind since that moment at the execution site. Why had Yamamoto bowed to him specifically? Why had he shared his grief about his own brother? Yamamoto was quiet for a moment, then began to speak. Nakamura translated softly. Yamamoto explained that when he saw Morrison's face that morning, he recognized the expression. It was the same expression he saw in the mirror after learning of Kenji's death. The same pain, the same rage, the same emptiness. Yamamoto said he had been resigned to death, believing he deserved it as punishment for failing to save more lives during the war. But when he saw Morrison, he realized that his death would not bring Morrison peace, just as killing American soldiers had never brought Yamamoto peace after losing Kenji. The cycle would just continue. So he bowed to acknowledge their shared humanity, their shared loss. To say that he understood Morrison's pain because he felt it too. And perhaps, Yamamoto said quietly, to remind Morrison that the enemy he hated was also a man who loved his brother, who mourned, who suffered. Not because Yamamoto wanted mercy, but because he wanted Morrison to be free of the hatred before it consumed him the way it had consumed so many others. Morrison felt something break open inside his chest. Tears blurred his vision, and he didn't try to stop them. For the first time since receiving the telegram about David's death, he wept. Not tears of rage, but tears of grief. Pure, uncomplicated grief. Yamamoto bowed his head respectfully, giving Morrison space for his sorrow. When Morrison finally regained his composure, he asked Nakamura to translate something. He told Yamamoto that his brother David had wanted to be a doctor before the war. He had always been the gentle one, the one who cared for injured animals and volunteered at the local clinic. David would have been a good doctor. Yamamoto's eyes glistened. He told Morrison that Kenji had been a school teacher. He loved children and dreamed of opening a school in their village after the war. Kenji had written letters filled with plans for the future, right up until the day he died. For several minutes, the two men sat in that cell, enemies by circumstance but connected by grief, and shared stories about the brothers they had lost. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was understanding, and in that moment it was enough. The war in the Pacific ended 3 months later with Japan's surrender in August 1945. Takeshi Yamamoto was repatriated to Japan as part of the general prisoner exchange. Before he left Camp 17, he asked Nakamura to translate a final message to Morrison. He thanked the sergeant for seeking the truth and for honoring his brother's memory by refusing to let hatred define him. Yamamoto said he would return to his village and try to rebuild, to honor Kenji by teaching in his place. He hoped Morrison would find his own path to peace. Morrison watched as Yamamoto boarded the transport ship with hundreds of other former prisoners. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Yamamoto stood at the railing and bowed one last time. Morrison, standing on the pier in his uniform, slowly raised his hand in a final salute. It was a gesture of respect between soldiers, between men who had seen too much death and carried too much pain. Morrison returned to the United States in late 1945. He carried Yamamoto's story with him, and it changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He struggled with what had almost happened, with how close they had come to executing an innocent man. The memory of Yamamoto's bow haunted him, but not in a dark way. It reminded him that every enemy soldier had a story, a family, dreams that would never be fulfilled. Morrison went home to his parents' farm in Iowa and tried to rebuild his life, but he couldn't settle. The farm felt too small, too quiet after everything he had experienced. One night, sitting at the dinner table with his aging parents, Morrison announced his decision. He was going to use the GI Bill to go to medical school. His mother wept with joy. His father, a stern man who rarely showed emotion, gripped Morrison's shoulder and said David would be proud. Morrison studied hard, driven by a purpose he couldn't fully articulate. He graduated in 1951 and began practicing as a family physician in a small town in Iowa. He treated everyone who came through his door with the same care and dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Years passed. Morrison married, had children, and built a quiet life. But he never forgot Takeshi Yamamoto. Every year on the anniversary of that day at the execution site, Morrison would take out a small photograph he had kept from the war and reflect on how a single moment of humanity had changed his entire life. In 1971, Morrison received an unexpected letter. It was forwarded through military channels written in careful English with occasional Japanese characters. It was from Takeshi Yamamoto. The letter explained that Yamamoto had spent decades trying to locate Morrison through various veteran organizations and the Red Cross. He wanted Morrison to know that he had kept his promise. He had returned to his village and built a school in Kenji's name. For 26 years he had taught children, trying to build a future where the hatred of the past could not take root. Yamamoto wrote that he thought of Morrison often and hoped the sergeant had found peace. He included a photograph of himself standing in front of a small school building, surrounded by smiling children. Morrison sat at his kitchen table holding that letter and photograph for a long time. His wife found him there an hour later, tears running down his face. She asked what was wrong. Morrison shook his head and said nothing was wrong. For the first time in decades, something felt right. He wrote back immediately. Thus began a correspondence that would last for the next 15 years. Morrison and Yamamoto exchanged letters 3 or 4 times a year, sharing their lives, their families, their hopes and regrets. They wrote about their children growing up, about the challenges of aging, about the world changing around them. They never spoke about the war directly, but it was always there between the lines, the shared trauma that had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances. In 1986, Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced he was traveling to Japan. His children thought he was crazy. He was 72 years old with a bad heart. But Morrison was determined. He had to make this journey. His wife accompanied him, worried but supportive. They flew to Tokyo, then took a train to the rural village where Yamamoto lived. It was a beautiful place, nestled in green hills with rice terraces climbing the slopes. Morrison's heart pounded as they approached the address Yamamoto had provided. And there, standing in the doorway of a modest house, was Takeshi Yamamoto. He was old now, bent with age, his hair white and thin, but his eyes were the same, clear and kind. For a long moment the two men simply stared at each other across 4 decades of time and distance. Then Yamamoto stepped forward and bowed deeply. Morrison bowed in return, awkward and unfamiliar with the gesture but determined to show respect. And then, breaking all protocol and expectation, the 2 old soldiers embraced. They held each other like brothers, 2 men who had survived a war that should have made them eternal enemies but instead had connected them in ways deeper than hatred. Morrison spent a week in that village as Yamamoto's guest. They visited the school Yamamoto had built, where Morrison spoke to the students about the importance of peace and understanding. They walked through the countryside, 2 old men moving slowly but purposefully, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, sitting on Yamamoto's porch and watching the sun set over the rice fields, Yamamoto said something that Morrison never forgot. He said that the war had taken their brothers, but it had also given them each other. Not as a fair exchange, never that, but as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, there were still small lights that refused to be extinguished. Morrison had tried to be one of those lights by seeking truth over vengeance, and in doing so, he had saved not just Yamamoto's life, but his own soul. Morrison returned to the United States knowing it was probably the last time he would see Yamamoto. His heart was growing weaker, and the journey had exhausted him. But he felt at peace in a way he had never experienced before. He had honored David's memory not through hatred and revenge, but through choosing mercy and truth. Takeshi Yamamoto passed away in 1990 at the age of 85. Morrison received the news from Yamamoto's daughter in a tearful letter. She wrote that her father's final words had been about the American soldier who had saved his life and become his friend. She thanked Morrison for giving her father 45 extra years, years that had allowed him to raise a family, teach hundreds of children, and find meaning in a world that had once seemed destroyed by war. Morrison attended a memorial service held by the local Japanese-American community in honor of Yamamoto. He spoke about the man who had taught him that humanity could exist even in the midst of hatred, that understanding could bridge even the deepest divides. James Morrison died peacefully in his sleep in 1993 at the age of 79. At his funeral, his children discovered something they had never known about. Among their father's most treasured possessions was a small wooden box containing letters, photographs, and a faded diary written in Japanese. It was Takeshi Yamamoto's diary from the war, the one that had saved his life. Morrison had kept it all those years as a reminder of the day he chose truth over vengeance. His oldest son, reading through the letters, discovered the full story of what had happened at Camp 17 in 1945. He learned about the POW, the execution that never happened, and the friendship that had grown from the ashes of war. The family decided that their father's story needed to be shared. They donated his letters and Yamamoto's diary to the National World War II Museum, where they remain today as a testament to the power of human compassion, even in the darkest times. The story of Sergeant James Morrison and Takeshi Yamamoto has been studied by historians, psychologists, and peace advocates around the world. It represents a rare moment when the machinery of war was stopped by a simple act of human recognition. Yamamoto's bow was not a plea for mercy but an acknowledgement of shared humanity. And Morrison's response, his willingness to question his own certainty and seek truth, demonstrated a moral courage that is far rarer than physical bravery. Their story reminds us that every person, even those we consider enemies, has a story, a family, and dreams that war has shattered. It challenges us to see beyond uniforms and flags to the human beings underneath. It asks us to consider what we lose when we allow hatred to blind us to truth, and what we gain when we choose understanding over revenge. In 2015, 70 years after the end of World War II, the families of James Morrison and Takeshi Yamamoto met for the first time at a peace conference in Hawaii. Morrison's grandchildren and Yamamoto's grandchildren stood together, sharing stories about the two old soldiers who had become unlikely friends. They planted a cherry tree in a memorial garden, a living symbol of peace growing from the seeds of understanding planted decades before. Today, that tree stands as a reminder that the choices we make in moments of crisis define not just our own lives, but the legacy we leave for future generations. James Morrison chose truth when vengeance would have been easier. Takeshi Yamamoto chose dignity and honesty, even when facing death. Together, they proved that humanity can survive even the worst that human beings can inflict upon each other. Their story is not about forgiveness or forgetting the horrors of war. It is about recognizing that the path to peace begins with seeing the humanity in those we have been taught to hate. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Give this video a like and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Morrison and Yamamoto's remarkable journey. Their story deserves to be remembered and shared so that future generations might learn from their example.